Ladies and gentlemen, get the book Dr. Joshua Bowen wrote, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. It is extremely full of knowledge and information for anyone, as well as join the Patreon. There's hundreds of videos that have been not released to the internet. You can ask questions and I will record them with these scholars in high definition. I do that all the time. You can also personal message me and you help the community grow. Thanks a lot. Dr. Joshua Bowen. I'm going to try to ask this as succinctly as possible. My patrons have been trying to give me good criticisms about how to do this. So how does archaeology debunk, if I could use the term, or kind of cut through the biblical narrative? So the Bible versus archaeology. Take us through the problems.
Yeah, so I mean, sort of, and I guess as I answer, you can interject and develop or steer me where you want me to go. But big picture here is, and again, I'm not an archaeologist. I've got a fair amount of archaeological training. I've been an archaeological excavation, but I think there are professional archaeologists. So, I want to be clear from the outset about that. But the information that I'll give is sort of consensus archaeological position. Okay. There is this idea, I think, among Christian apologists that if we can go to the Bible, which the Old Testament, for example, that we're starting off assuming that it's correct and that what it's presenting is historically reliable. Then if we can go into different areas of investigation and find consistency with it, that lends greater and greater credibility to the thing that we already believe is historically reliable. So when you read something in the book of Daniel and it says Belshazzar, and 100 years ago, scholars are like, we don't know anything about any Belshazzar. And then archaeology pulls up, oh, here's Belshazzar. They're like, aha, see, it proves the Bible.
Right.
Okay. It's not really how that works. Because the goal of, there's no goal of archaeology when it comes to proving or disproving the Bible. That's not, like, biblical archaeologists, they don't do that anymore. I've got a chapter in my book where I talk about sort of how biblical archaeology has evolved as a discipline. And before, that was really the point of biblical archaeology. It was to, either illuminate the biblical text or even in cases to defend it. And so even as late as like the 60s with people like William Albright, that he has this like basic idea that the Hebrew Bible is historically reliable, and so as we dig down into the ground, it's going to illuminate and confirm the historical reliability of the biblical text. Well, we're not there anymore, and the short answer why, or the short reason why, is that as they dig up more sites, it becomes clear that the timeline, the chronological, layout of the narrative that the Bible has doesn't match what we see coming up out of the ground. So, what is it that archaeology does? Well, William Deaver, I think, makes a really good case for archaeological data being primary evidence, primary data, in that it's not subjected or it's not subject to the biases that, for example, propagandistic textual pieces are subjected to.
If I may, just in what you're saying, someone who hears this that might be a Christian might automatically go, you're already trying to do that against the Bible. No, what you're actually saying is not just biblical, you're talking Sumerian, Akkadian, like it doesn't matter what the context or what society, archaeology is going to go with what the facts are on the ground and the evidence there. Now, sometimes stuff might be missing. Sometimes there's limits to what you can do. But texts that are propagandistic or potentially mythology, or the genre may not be literal, it might utilize people, places, things, et cetera, like that, you would be equally applying it to other cultures as well.
Absolutely, and this is the real issue. Let's take an example with the third millennium. There's this big conflict that we know about, the 𝀭 border conflict. I talk about this in the book, in the history chapter. And the documents that we have that tell us about this border conflict between the city of 𝀭 and the city of 𝀭 are from 𝀭, right? And they're inscriptions, they're these royal inscriptions that are from the vantage point, from the position of the kings of ����. So what you would expect to see is what we find. So if you read through, so to sort of very briefly lay this out, there is this field, or this grouping of fields that lie in between the city of 𝀭 and the city of ���� in southern Mesopotamia. And they are under, like, they're in dispute between these, like, this is how cities worked, right? You have people in the city and then the people that are in the hinterland, that are in the countryside, that are providing food and other necessities from agricultural products, and grazing areas for animal husbandry. That's what. So the steppe is really, really important to the city. So it's going to, as cities come closer, and you have this sort of field in between them, Hatfield and McCoy sort of, that's our land, that's our land, that's our land. And so if you're getting it from the perspective of 𝀭, of course, 𝀭 has agreed that this is ����sh's field and that they're renting it from ���� and that they didn't pay the rent that they were supposed to pay. And so that's why 𝀭 had to go fight them for it. Why ���� had to go fight them for it. And ���� is perfectly justified in doing that. It's a mandate of the gods why they do it. Right? Well, if you got 𝀭's, which we don't have, but if you got 𝀭's account, they'd be saying, this is 𝀭's field, and ���� is renting it out from 𝀭, and they trespassed, and that's why we had to go to war against them. Okay, well, the texts that we're getting are propagandistic, right? They're spun, right? Fake news. It's not that the historical, basic historical facts aren't, reliable in general. Like, is there a border conflict? Yeah. Is there a battle between them? Yeah. But it's the specifics, how it plays out, why it plays out. Those are things that are spun, and we understand why. And nobody disputes that. However, when you come to the biblical text, we don't often notice that spin because we see this as a holy text. Okay. So what archaeology does is archaeology says, okay, let's look at something like the Exodus narrative, or let's look at something like the conquest account. And, when biblical archaeologists 100 years ago were going out into, Palestine and digging down and finding cities like Jericho and Ai and Hatzor and, Megiddo and all these other cities that are important in the stories of the Hebrew Bible, they're digging down trying to confirm and defend, here, see how it matches up to what the Bible says. Well, as time went by and more data came in, it was that doesn't really match up very well. So, for example, the city of Ai is a great example of this. The city of Ai, which in Joshua 7, I think, undergoes this ambush and is destroyed. And it's supposed to be this, great city, and they initially, fight off the Israelites, but then they're ultimately defeated. Well, archaeologists go out there and they dig down and they go, wait a minute, there's not even a city here at the end of the second millennium. In fact, there hasn't been a city here since it was destroyed in the middle of the third millennium.
So they're taking ruins, correct me if I'm wrong, they're taking ruins and writing a narrative as if they are the one, like, it's almost like if you and me came across something living in America, and we're up here near Pennsylvania, Maryland, we found 1,000-year-old
Stonehenge. Use Stonehenge.
Okay.
I think that's great. Like any Hellboy, if you watch the Hellboy.
Right.
Like the Hellboy 2, I just watched it a couple weeks ago. You know, it might not have been Stonehenge, but it was something similar to that. Or Doctor Who uses it in the same way. Like, what do we think about Stonehenge? Well, there's got to be some alien aspect to it, or there's something that's otherworldly. There's some sort of something that we don't know about that's established this. And so, like that in Hellboy, that's where they're at. They're up in the Scottish Highlands or something, and there's these big rocks. It wasn't Stonehenge, but it was these big rocks, and they're trying to find this entrance to find the Golden Army. And they blow this whistle, and the rocks that are sort of spread out there come up out of the ground as this huge giant.
Right.
Okay. So, like, stories build up around these major monuments, these superstructures, big ruins like that. This is what happens.
Right.
And if you don't know the background, and you, particularly if you're coming into intermittent contact with them, as pastoral nomads, you're grazing your sheep and you're coming up on these ruins and you're looking at them, and stories are being spun about what actually happened here. Mm-hmm. Legends can build up very easily about, and this is what's important about Canaan. If you look at throughout the early Bronze and Middle Bronze ages, you see that there's these periods of great expansion, monumental architecture, these huge buildings, huge walls, big fortifications. And then, famine hits or climate change, hits, and people can't sustain life inside those city walls anymore. And so they become more, they start to go out into pastoral nomadism, which is, you can seasonally migrate and it's easier to survive that way. And so now these cities get abandoned. Well, now a couple hundred years go by, these ruins are here, it's mud brick, or, the stones starting to kind of fall down or whatever. And you're looking at, people are looking at this thing, go, wow, look at these giant walls, these giant buildings. And stories start to develop. I thought, well, giants must have built these things, right?
No, our ancestors actually destroyed these people.
Yes.
Because our God was on our side.
That's right. And so those things can be used to develop whatever narrative it is that you're trying to develop. So then that's why when an archaeologist goes and he digs a sounding, right? He digs down in several places on the site. And, she comes to the data and goes, whoa, like the occupation layers that we see here, there is no occupation in the late Bronze Age, in the early Iron Age. Like, I don't actually remember when I is repopulated. But the time of the destruction that's supposed to happen, nothing, right? Hadn't been anything for more than 1,000 years. So then how do you engage with that sort of thing? Well, archaeology, like biblical archaeology, has moved, it's shifted. And so they're not, if you look at, you go to like the Oriental Institute's website and you see these lectures by biblical archaeologists, who are talking about the origins of Israel, the formation of Israel, or the early centuries of Israel, late Bronze Age, early Iron Age. They're not concerned about we have to disprove the Bible or we have to prove the Bible.
Not
who cares?
Even, yeah.
It's not even on their mind. It's all right. We need to use the Hebrew Bible as a source, because why wouldn't we use it as a source? Right. In the same way that we'd want to use royal inscriptions as a source. But that doesn't mean that, you again, I always use Sargon's 8th campaign. You use it as a source to say things like, all right, well, it seems like there was a battle against Urartu. Well, here he talks about Urartu being fought. But that doesn't mean you then fill in the gaps and say, oh, okay, so the king himself ran ahead of his army because his army was slowing him down, and then you write the history based on how amazingly fast and powerful Sargon was. No, it's not how that works. And if the archaeology reveals that, hey, there was no destruction in the late Bronze Age and in the early Iron Age, at this site, well then you have to rethink, why is it that this later text is telling this story about this conquest? And I think the failing of people that are still trying to argue, there's a book on the shelf, I can't remember the guy that wrote, Kennedy is his name, evangelical Christian who's essentially, I haven't read it all the way through, but just from what I looked at, it seems like trying to, salvage the archaeological data and say, well, actually it can fit, right? As Joel Baden would say, like, miss me with that shit, right? Like, that's not what we're supposed to be doing. It's not what biblical archaeologists are supposed to be doing. It's, you look at sources of information for writing history, for doing historiography, and you say, how can we, like the rake and shovel method, right? You rake in the good stuff, shovel out the bad stuff. You don't start with the premise that this is a holy text, this is an inspired text, and until proven otherwise, we assume that it's right. I don't think that's the way to go. If you want to start that way, like, it is what it is. I think that's how, it's definitely how it was done. It was assumed that it was right.
Would you say Hofmeyr, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think like Hofmeyr does tremendous work. Kenneth Kitchen does tremendous work as Egyptologists. But then when they come into these areas of investigation, I mean, I think that their theological commitments color their research, right? And when I talk to other Egyptologists about this, they'll say, yeah, Hofmeyr does great work, and I hate using people's names like that,
no,
but I think it's appropriate here because it's about the Exodus, but they're brilliant scholars, there's no question. But when you get into these areas where I think that they have a tension with their theological commitments and what they think about this text, and the archaeological or historical data, and they go, like, I think that the way they come at it is not the way that I would come at it, and it's not the way that I think most scholars come at it.
I think it's better that you get people, like you said, who are going to approach it like they would any other royal inscription from some other, I think you're right. Because then it doesn't allow you're weighing in one side more than the other.
I don't think you want to approach any ancient text and say, we're going to think it's all wrong until we have archaeological or whatever, textual, anything, confirmation. I mean, things that show it to be true. I don't think that's the right way to go about it.
Right.
On the other hand, I don't think you go, all right, we're going to assume this is all true for the most part until we have evidence that disproves it. I don't think that's a good way to go. There's this sort of happy medium where you say, all right, I'm going to use, I come to this text and I say, okay, what genre is this text? All right, it seems like there's some supernatural, mythological, legendary things that are in it. And so maybe we start on that with that premise that, okay, it's probably okay to assume that there's some historical reality behind it, some kernel of historical reality behind it. But, all right, let's go investigate. We don't want to assume that all of it's right. And then as you excavate these cities and you go, okay, well, sure shit, seems like, as I always like quoting Bill Deaver, but he says, like, I think 38 of the 40 sites that the conquest talks about don't fit the archaeological data. They don't fit what the narrative has. And so, like, 2 out of 40 that's not very good.
And one of them, I think, that did fit was like they saw that it had been burned.
Yeah.
And it's like,
yeah.
I mean, how many places when you go to destroy get burnt? Or they might have, I mean, it's just like...
Like, just because Hatzor has this destruction layer that fits the timeline, and I think there's even some contention, again, it's not my field, but I think there's even some contention about that, but assuming that it fits perfectly, all that is it's not disconfirming. Right. That's the key. And it, like, cities get burned all the time.
That's what I was going to say. So it doesn't require the Israelites themselves.
Exactly.
And it might have been a Canaanite thing that happened at the time that was carried over. Or Yeah, there's so many ways that you can look at it.
Yeah.
So to put it simply, because we could go on and on, I'm sure, and this is a topic that I'd love to get like Dr. William Deaver on one day.
Yes,
and talk
that would be amazing. He could do this so much better than I could.
It's really cool though hearing you. Yeah. I like to get different scholars who talk about this, even though this isn't your particular wheelhouse. You've done these things to some extent. I just wanted to kind of like say, if you had to pick which one for trying to understand the reality, archaeology or the Bible, it sounds like archaeology has way more tools within its wheelhouse because it's not just pulling from the biblical source. See, archaeology isn't just archaeology. Archaeology is using the Bible as well as using any other ancient Near Eastern source to try and draw what may or may not have happened in reality. Whereas if you look at the Bible, you're only getting one propagandistic position. And if you start as a Christian, you're not going to say propagandistic. You're going to think purely reality. This is true history. I've heard Christians like almost laugh when Dr. Price would say, well, if the Exodus happened, it seems like God sent his angels down with vacuum cleaners to clean up the mess. So there was no evidence of it. Or at least as described in the Bible. So you got to go, are you going to believe that God like hid the evidence or Satan's trying to deceive everyone so he hides the evidence? I mean, how silly do you have to get?
There is a quote that I use all the time, and I think, watch, I won't be able to find the book as I never can find the books.
You always find the books. What do you mean?
I know, but it always takes me like 10 minutes. There it is. It's an old 1987 scripture meaning and method, but there's this article in here by Lester Graby, and he has this amazing quote, and I think it fits beautifully here. And I just have to find it, 133, because I think I use it in my book, and I don't know, it just sums up so well. He's talking about fundamentalists. It's a great article. But he's talking about fundamentalists, and sorry, where is it?
What page is that?
I'm trying to find where the quote is specifically. Because he sums it up. Here it is. Okay. In his conclusion, it's on page 148. What I have attempted to demonstrate here is not that one way of understanding the book of Daniel is somehow the right one. So he's talking about aspects of the dating of the book of Daniel. On the contrary, scholarship is always pushing beyond today's status quo, probing, challenging, applying new data and new theory. What I have been trying to show is that despite noises to the contrary, fundamentalism is incompatible with scholarship. Fundamentalism has already determined its conclusions. It is not seeking because it already knows the answer. If it has good evidence on its side which supports the Bible, it uses it. If it has little data, it twists and interprets what it has to support the Bible. If it has no evidence, it hypothesizes that such will eventually be found. And of course, no amount of contrary evidence is sufficient. Fundamentalism can never conclude that the Bible is wrong.
Wow. Well said. Thank you, Dr. Josh.
Of course.